The year was 1942. The snow over the Ural Mountains fell in thick, endless sheets, covering everything in white except the grey skeleton of the Kirov Industrial Plant. The war had dragged on longer than anyone imagined, and the Soviet Union was fighting for its very survival. Inside the plant, the rhythm of war was a heartbeat, hammers, lathes, the hiss of molten metal. But this was no ordinary factory. Here, men and women worked 14-hour shifts rebuilding tanks that had crawled back from the front lines, twisted and burned. Amid the noise stood Yefim Volkov, a 38-year-old mechanic with hands scarred from years of welding. He wasn't an officer, not even a party member, just a man who'd watched too many of his friends vanish into the front without armour or hope. Every day, Volkov repaired what was left of T-34s, KV-1s and BT-7s, sending them back east toward Stalingrad. Every night he listened to the distant artillery echoing over the steppe. He knew the front was getting closer, and in that frozen winter something broke inside him. Not despair, but defiance. Before the war, Yefim had been a railway mechanic from Perm. He knew locomotives better than most generals knew maps. He could repair a drive shaft blindfolded, forge a piston with scrap, and once built an entire boiler engine from salvaged wrecks. But he was also known for his temper and his tongue. He often mocked the party inspectors who toured the factory, calling them clipboard soldiers. That earned him the nickname the Mad Mechanic. When news came that the Germans were approaching Sverdlovsk, Yefim gathered his crew, welders, machinists, and apprentices barely 17, and said, "If the army can't reach us, then we'll reach the army." At first, they laughed. But when a convoy of refugees brought word that an entire Soviet regiment had been cut off without armour, the laughter stopped. Volkov's idea was insane. Turn an abandoned freight locomotive into an armoured fortress on rails, part train, part tank, capable of fighting as it moved. It sounded like a drunken fantasy, but Volkov had already drawn the first sketches on the back of an old ration form. In the depths of the Kirov plant's yard sat a half-wrecked steam engine, locomotive number 1079. Its boiler was cracked, its wheels frozen to the rails. To most, it was scrap metal. To Volkov, it was the heart of a weapon. He scavenged armour plating from destroyed KV-1 tanks, bolted it to the sides of the locomotive, and reinforced the cabin with angled steel sheets to deflect shells. For weaponry, he proposed something unheard of, mounting a 76mm gun turret from a T-34 directly on the flatbed car behind the engine. He called the project Zheleznaya Ruka, the Iron Hand. Night after night, under blackout conditions, his team welded and bolted, stealing parts from whatever lay around. When inspectors questioned the missing materials, Volkov bribed them with vodka or simply shouted until they left. Soon the machine began to take shape, a fortified train that could tow ammunition, transport wounded, and fight back, all at once. To make it work, Volkov had to solve an impossible problem: recoil. A tank gun firing from a stationary flat car would tear itself off the rails. So he engineered a sliding recoil system using hydraulic dampers scavenged from aircraft landing gear and a counterweight made of concrete poured into the chassis. It shouldn't have worked, but it did. During the first night test, the gun roared and the train only jolted back a few meters. Word spread through the factory like fire. Workers began calling the train Volkov's Beast. Even hardened engineers admitted they'd never seen anything like it. By February 1942, the Iron Hand was fully armoured, front cab plated with 50mm steel, gun turret with full traverse, 2 machine gun nests on each flank, boiler shielded with sandbags and coal sacks. It was ugly, loud, and utterly magnificent. The Soviet authorities didn't approve of independent projects. Every innovation had to pass through the bureaucracy of the People's Commissariat. But Volkov didn't ask for permission. When an NKVD inspector finally discovered the armoured locomotive, he ordered it dismantled immediately. "Unauthorized construction," he barked. Volkov stared at him, wiped his hands on an oily rag, and said, "Comrade, if you want to stop it, you can try standing in front of it." The inspector left and never returned. A week later, news reached the factory that a German armoured column had broken through the front, only 30 kilometres away. There were no tanks to defend the rail junction. Volkov and his crew rolled the Iron Hand out of the yard, loaded it with ammunition, and steamed west into the night. The factory workers cheered as it disappeared into the snow, its red star glowing faintly through the fog. No one realized they were watching the birth of a legend. The Iron Hand thundered west across the frozen steppe, its boiler glowing orange against the snow. It was not part of any official regiment. It had no command, no flag. Only a handful of workers turned soldiers and a single mad mechanic at the controls. The train's whistle cut through the night like a war cry. Inside, Volkov and his crew, 12 men and 3 women, loaded shells into the T-34 turret mounted on the flat car. The rest manned machine guns welded onto the sides. They had scavenged ammunition from the wrecks of other tanks and even forged their own shells in the plant's furnace. Their goal was to reach Kamyshlov Junction, a strategic railway node the Germans were trying to seize. If that line fell, supply trains to the front would stop, and the defense of Stalingrad would weaken. When dawn came, smoke rose in the distance. The junction was already under attack. Volkov shouted over the roar of the engine, "Forward! If we stop, we die." And so the Iron Hand rolled straight into battle. The German troops at Kamyshlov were not expecting a train to attack them. When the armoured locomotive emerged from the tree line, its armour blackened with soot, it looked like something out of a nightmare. The 76mm gun fired first, hurling a shell into an armoured car on the road. The explosion tore it apart. The flat cars behind the locomotive carried boxes of ammunition and sandbags for cover, a makeshift fortress on rails. German machine gun nests opened fire, bullets sparking harmlessly off the armoured plating. Volkov's gunners replied with a storm of fire, cutting down anything that moved near the tracks. By mid-morning, the Iron Hand had destroyed 2 Panzer IIIs, 3 troop trucks, and forced a retreat from the station. Soviet infantry arriving later that day found Volkov's crew still fighting, covered in soot and ice, but alive. Word spread quickly. A mysterious armoured train built by civilians had turned the tide of a battle. To the locals, it became the ghost train. Over the following months, the Iron Hand moved along the front like a phantom. It struck supply lines, shelled artillery positions, and evacuated wounded soldiers. Each time it appeared, the Germans scrambled to destroy it, but it was never in the same place twice. Volkov learned to camouflage the train with snow-covered tarps during the day and move only at night. At one point, he modified the locomotive's headlights with shutters made from tank hatches, allowing him to ride in darkness and open them for a flash of light during combat, blinding enemy gunners for a few seconds. Soviet commanders began sending coded radio messages directly to Volkov's team. They were never officially recognized, but everyone on the front knew. When you heard the thunder of that strange armoured train in the distance, reinforcements had arrived. Its legend grew with every victory, but with fame came danger, especially from Moscow. By late 1942, reports of Volkov's armoured train reached the ears of the People's Commissariat of Defence. While the Red Army celebrated its ingenuity, the NKVD saw something else. A potential rebellion. A civilian commanding an unauthorized weapon, ignoring orders and gaining local fame. That was a political threat. An order went out from Moscow. Locate and requisition the armoured train operating near Kamyshlov. The crew is to be reassigned or detained for interrogation. But the Iron Hand was already deep behind German lines, aiding a trapped Soviet division. When the order reached them by radio, Volkov read it twice, then tore it in half. "Let them come arrest us," he said. "We'll save the country first." He knew what defying Moscow meant, but for him, survival of his people came before orders. That night, they intercepted a German column crossing a bridge near Lake Balkhash. The Iron Hand stopped, aimed its gun, and fired 3 times. The bridge collapsed, sending tanks plunging into the river below. The next morning, Soviet scouts found the wreckage and a single message carved into a steel plate near the tracks. The Iron Hand was here. In early 1943, Volkov's defiance reached its peak. His crew had grown to more than 50 men and women, soldiers, deserters, engineers, and locals who joined him after seeing what the train could do. They formed what they called the People's Battalion of the Rails, independent, unrecognized, and fiercely loyal only to one another. When the NKVD finally caught up, they sent a detachment to seize the train at night near Verkhnyaya Pishma. The officer in charge ordered Volkov to surrender the Iron Hand and disband his unit immediately. Volkov refused. "You weren't there when they burned our homes," he said. "You didn't build this train. You didn't bleed for it." The officer reached for his pistol, and Volkov's crew leveled their guns. A shot rang out in the dark, and the standoff erupted into chaos. In the confusion, Volkov ordered the engine stoked and the throttle open. The Iron Hand roared forward, smashing through barricades, leaving the burning camp behind. From that moment, they were no longer soldiers of the Soviet Union. They were outlaws, hunted by both sides. For months, the train vanished into the forests of the Urals, striking only when supply trains or German patrols approached. To the villagers, it became something mythical, a moving fortress, led by the mad mechanic who fought everyone. The NKVD called it Operation Steel Ghost. The Germans called it the Russian Monster. But Volkov called it what it had always been. Our home, our machine, our rebellion. By the end of 1943, the Iron Hand had become both a weapon and a myth. To some, it was a symbol of defiance and courage, a machine that fought for the people when the system failed them. To others, it was a rogue engine of anarchy that needed to be erased. Snow blanketed the rails north of Perm, where Volkov and his crew hid for weeks inside an abandoned rail tunnel. The once polished armour was pitted and scarred. The red star on the boiler was barely visible beneath layers of ash. Fuel was running low. Their gun barrel was warped from hundreds of rounds fired. But worse than hunger was the silence. The radio was filled with static. No news from Moscow, no orders from the front. They were alone in the snowbound forest, cut off from everything they'd once fought for. Volkov sat in the engine room beside the boiler, his hands black with coal dust, his eyes fixed on the flames. He knew the war was turning. Stalingrad had been won. The Red Army was advancing. But for him, there was no place left in the new order. His revolt had made him a hero to some and a traitor to others. In February 1944, the crew received word from a railway telegraph operator in Yugorsk. A German armoured train was moving through the region, escorting a convoy of captured Soviet artillery. It was too tempting to ignore. The Iron Hand set out once more, steam pouring from its cracked boiler. They rolled through the frozen forest, cutting telegraph lines as they went, their wheels screaming against the ice. At dawn, they spotted the enemy train, sleek, black, and covered in camouflage nets. Volkov ordered his crew to wait in the fog near a switching yard. He had one last trick to play. They loaded their final rounds and reversed onto a side track. As the German train approached, Volkov released a brake cable he'd rigged to a derailed freight car. The wreckage rolled down the track, crashing into the enemy locomotive. In the moment of confusion, the Iron Hand opened fire. The first shell hit squarely on the enemy's forward gun car. The second pierced its boiler, sending a fountain of steam and flame into the sky. For 20 minutes, the forest shook with artillery fire. Then, suddenly, silence. The German train was a heap of twisted iron, its crew dead or fled. But the victory came at a terrible price. A round from the enemy's rear gun had hit the Iron Hand's coal car, igniting the supply wagon. Fire raced along the train, devouring ammunition and shells. Volkov ordered his crew to jump. He stayed behind to reverse the engine, sending the burning train rolling toward the enemy lines, a runaway inferno of steel and vengeance. The explosion was seen from 20 kilometers away. When the smoke cleared, the Iron Hand was gone. All that remained was a scorched section of track and a trail of molten metal frozen in the snow. Of the 50 men and women who'd served on the train, less than a dozen survived. They were found days later by Soviet patrols, half-frozen, shell-shocked, and silent. Yefim Volkov was not among them. According to the survivors, he'd been last seen in the engine cab, one hand on the throttle and the other saluting as the train vanished into fire. His body was never recovered. Some said he'd been incinerated in the blast. Others believed he'd escaped into the forest and lived out his days in hiding. Within weeks, NKVD agents sealed the area and classified all reports. The official record simply read, "Unidentified armoured train destroyed in combat. No further details." And with that, the story of the mad mechanic was buried under bureaucracy and snow. When the war ended in 1945, no one spoke of Volkov again. The Kirov plant resumed production of tractors and industrial equipment. Newspapers celebrated heroes chosen by the party, not renegades who'd built their own weapons. But in the villages along the Trans-Siberian line, people told different stories. Old rail workers swore they'd seen the train's headlights shining through the fog long after the war ended. Some claimed that on cold nights they heard the echo of its whistle, a single haunting note rolling across the snow. In the 1950s, an engineer surveying the area near Yugorsk found a rusted section of armor plate half buried in the earth. Stamped into it were the words, "Zheleznaya Ruka, 1942. He turned it in to authorities. It was quietly stored in a warehouse and forgotten again. Decades later, after the fall of the Soviet Union, historians revisited the archives of the Kirov plant. In a dusty file marked Unauthorized Projects, classified 1942, they found schematics drawn in pencil on yellowed paper. The signature at the bottom read, Y. Volkov. It was a design for an armoured train with a tank turret, identical to eyewitness accounts. Next to it was a handwritten note. Built by workers of Kirov for the defence of our motherland. Not approved, not forgotten. Today, a small plaque at the Sverdlovsk Railway Museum bears his name. Yefim Volkov, 1904-1944. Engineer, mechanic, rebel. Creator of the Iron Hand. Each year, railway workers leave a red flower at the display. Not because he was a hero in the party's eyes, but because he was one of them. The story of the mad mechanic remains a whisper in history, a tale of steel and defiance. A reminder that sometimes one man's madness can forge a legend that no regime can erase. He was a worker. He built a weapon out of scrap. He fought for a country that never wanted to remember him. But the rails still remember. They always remember.